The world was ready to condemn him as a henchman of a notorious dictator, a war criminal serving a fascist regime. Yet, in March 1942, amidst the red dust of Kenya, his funeral defied all logic of total war. The pallbearers carrying his coffin were the very British soldiers who had fought against him, and enemy generals stood rigid under the African sun to offer him a final, magnificent salute. He was a paradox wrapped in a uniform, the Iron Duke, who made even his captors weep. How does a man fighting in the name of Benito Mussolini end up being genuinely mourned as a hero by the army of Winston Churchill? To understand the sheer weight of this tragedy, and to comprehend why those British officers stood saluting under the African sun, we must first strip away the medals and the titles. We must go back to the beginning to understand the peculiar alchemy of bloodline, education, and temperament that forged Amedeo of Aosta. He was born in Turin in 1898 into the House of Savoy, one of the oldest ruling dynasties in the world. To be a Savoy was to be born into a rigid cage of protocol, duty, and military expectation. But Amedeo was carved from a distinctly different block than the head of his family, his cousin, King Victor Emmanuel III. The king was a man famous for his diminutive stature, he was barely 5 feet tall, and his painfully recessive personality. He was uncharismatic, increasingly beholden to the political winds blowing from Rome, and generally viewed without much warmth by his subjects. Amedeo was his antithesis. He was statuesque, devastatingly handsome, and possessed of an easy, natural magnetism that drew people to him. Where the king was awkward and silent, the duke was boisterous and charming. In a monarchy that was already showing cracks, Amedeo was the shining alternative, the what-if prince who looked every inch a king. It was a natural popularity that would eventually make him a source of deep paranoia for the fascist regime that was slowly rising to power in Italy. But there is a crucial detail in his biography, one that makes his eventual fate fighting against the British Empire so bitterly ironic. Amedeo was in spirit, temperament, and education profoundly Anglophile. He was perhaps the most English Italian prince in history. His mother was Princess Helene of Orleans. Though French royalty by blood, she had spent much of her youth in exile in England, absorbed its culture, and developed a deep affection for the British way of life. She was determined that her sons would not just be products of the rigid Italian court system. She wanted them to have the breadth of character that she believed only an English education could provide. And so, an extraordinary thing happened. The young Italian prince was packed off to England. He traded the Baroque palaces of Turin for the muddy playing fields and ancient stone halls of Eton College. Picture this gangly, incredibly tall Italian teenager navigating the intense, unspoken codes of the British upper class before the First World War. It was here, in the classrooms and on the cricket pitches, that Amedeo absorbed something that would define his entire military career, the concept of fair play. He learned the peculiar British virtue of stoicism, the idea that complaining was vulgar, and the fundamental belief that how you fought a battle mattered just as much as winning it. He lost his Italian accent almost entirely, speaking English with the clipped, polished tones of the Edwardian aristocracy. He was known to his schoolmates simply as a good sport, a tall, lanky chap who was quick to laugh at himself and fiercely loyal to his friends. He continued his education at Oxford, deepening his ties to a country that would, just a few decades later, become his jailer. Years later, some of the very British generals plotting his defeat in the mountains of Ethiopia would fondly recall sharing tea or playing cricket with him in the serene gardens of pre-war England. This shared history adds a layer of almost fratricidal sorrow to the conflict that followed. When the First World War erupted, shattering the peace of Europe, Amedeo returned to Italy. As a royal duke, he could easily have accepted a comfortable staff position far behind the lines, pushing paper and inspecting parades. Instead, he did something unheard of for someone of his rank. He enlisted in the artillery as a private. He wanted to experience the reality of the war, the mud, and the noise of the front lines. But the trenches were too static for his restless spirit. He looked up and saw the future of warfare. Aviation was in its infancy, a dangerous, romantic, and deadly pursuit. The casualty rates for pilots in WWI were astronomical. The aircraft were made of wood, canvas, and wire, highly flammable and prone to mechanical failure. This was where Amedeo found his true calling. He transferred to the Air Corps and became a pilot. There was something about the solitude of the cockpit that appealed to his nature. Up there, at 10,000 feet above the jagged peaks of the Alps, royal protocol didn't matter. Politics didn't matter. The sky didn't care who your cousin was. It was a duel of skill and nerve. He flew reconnaissance missions over Austrian lines, dodging anti-aircraft fire and engaging in dogfights. He didn't just survive the Great War, he excelled in it, ending the conflict decorated for bravery. A genuine war hero respected by the rank-and-file soldiers for his physical courage. The interwar years brought dark clouds over Italy. The rise of Benito Mussolini and the fascist party fundamentally changed the landscape. The monarchy, led by the weak Victor Emmanuel III, acquiesced to Mussolini's power grab, believing they could control him. Amedeo found himself in a precarious position during the 1920s and 30s. He was now a famous war hero, incredibly popular with the public and physically imposing. He was everything Mussolini wanted to be but wasn't. Mussolini, the Duce, was deeply suspicious of the Duke of Aosta. The dictator liked his royals docile, quiet, and preferably shorter than him. Amedeo was none of these things. He was independent-minded, he had deep connections to Britain, and he looked better in a uniform than the preening dictator ever could. There were whispers in anti-fascist circles that if the king ever found a spine and deposed Mussolini, Amedeo would be the man to lead the army in support of the crown. Whether to get him out of the way, to utilize his immense prestige, or perhaps a combination of both, Mussolini made a decision in 1937 that would seal Amedeo's fate. He appointed the Duke as the new Viceroy and Governor-General of Italian East Africa. Amedeo was being sent to govern an empire that had been forged in blood and poison gas. He was inheriting a crown of thorns. He packed his bags, leaving behind the familiar comforts of Europe for the vast, complicated, and hostile terrain of the Horn of Africa. He was traveling toward the greatest challenge of his life, a challenge that would test every lesson of honor and duty he had learned on the playing fields of Eton, and one that would ultimately demand the highest price. The arrival of Prince Amedeo in East Africa in late 1937 was not merely a change of administration. It was an attempt to perform a heart transplant on a dying patient. To understand the monumental task that lay before the Duke, one must first look at the blood-soaked ground he was stepping onto. The Italian Empire in East Africa, the Africa Orientale Italiana, was the crown jewel of Mussolini's propaganda, but in reality, it was a festering wound. The conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 and 1936 had been a brutal, mechanized slaughter. The Italians had used mustard gas against barefoot warriors. They had bombed Red Cross hospitals. They had crushed the Ethiopian army with a ruthlessness that shocked the world. But the conquest was only the beginning of the horror. The man Amedeo was replacing was Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. Graziani was a man who belonged to a different species of soldier than Amedeo. He was cold, sadistic, and believed only in the diplomacy of the bayonet. In February 1937, just months before Amedeo's arrival, an assassination attempt had been made on Graziani in Addis Ababa. Two Eritrean men had thrown grenades at the Viceroy during a public ceremony. Graziani survived, peppered with shrapnel, but his reaction was apocalyptic. He ordered a reprisal that would go down in history as the Yekati 12 massacre. For 3 days, Italian black shirts were given free rein to murder, loot, and burn in the capital. Thousands of innocent Ethiopian civilians were slaughtered in the streets. The intellectual class of the country was systematically hunted down and executed. The empire Amedeo inherited was one built on a foundation of absolute terror, where the silence of the population was not a sign of loyalty, but of paralyzed fear. When Amedeo stepped off the plane in Addis Ababa, the atmosphere was poisonous. The Italian garrison was jumpy, trigger-happy, living behind barbed wire and sandbags. The Ethiopian population looked at their occupiers with a hatred that burned hotter than the equatorial sun. Amedeo, the English-educated gentleman, the man of fair play, looked around at the devastation Graziani had left behind and was visibly sickened. He reportedly told his staff that such methods were not only morally repugnant, but strategically idiotic. You could not rule a territory the size of France and Spain combined by killing everyone who lived there. He began his tenure with a radical shift in tone. His first order of business was to stop the indiscriminate reprisals. He reined in the black shirt militias, telling them that the days of lawlessness were over. He released thousands of prisoners from the squalid detention camps where they had been rotting. He made a point of traveling through the countryside, often with a terrifyingly light security detail, to meet with local Ras, who were still waging a guerrilla war against Rome. There is a story from this period that perfectly encapsulates the Aosta style. During a tour of a remote province, his convoy was ambushed by Ethiopian partisans. Instead of ordering his men to burn the nearest village in retaliation, the standard Graziani operating procedure, Amedeo ordered his troops to hold fire. He stepped out of his vehicle, standing tall and exposed in the open road, and asked to speak to the leader. It was a gamble that bordered on madness, but it worked. He negotiated a local truce not with threats, but with personal charisma and a promise of justice. Under his viceroyship, the face of the empire began to change, superficially at least. He was a man obsessed with infrastructure. He believed, perhaps with a touch of naive colonial arrogance, that if he built enough roads, bridges, and hospitals, the Ethiopians would eventually accept Italian rule, and build he did. The engineering feats of the Italians in East Africa during this period were miraculous. They carved paved highways through mountain ranges that had previously been impassable to anything but a mule. They built Art Deco cinemas and villas in Asmara that still stand today, earning the city the nickname Little Rome. Amedeo oversaw the construction of clinics that treated malaria and eye infections for the local population. He even attempted, with varying degrees of success, to enforce the ban on the slave trade that still existed in parts of the Horn of Africa. For a brief, shimmering moment between 1938 and 1939, it seemed as if Amedeo might actually succeed. The guerrilla attacks decreased. The economy began to stabilize. He was genuinely popular with his own troops, who called him the Duca di Ferro, not for his cruelty, but for his unbending will and his presence on the front lines. Even some Ethiopians began to distinguish between the bad Italians and the good Italian. But Amedeo was living a lie, and he knew it. He was a decent man serving an indecent regime. No matter how many hospitals he built, he was still the representative of a foreign power that had stolen a sovereign nation. He was the velvet glove over the iron fist of fascism. And in Rome, the man pulling the strings was growing restless. Mussolini watched Amedeo's popularity with jealous eyes. He didn't want a good duke. He wanted a ruthless conqueror. But before Mussolini could replace him, a greater shadow fell across the world. September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. For 9 months, Italy stood on the sidelines, non-belligerent. In Addis Ababa, Amedeo watched the news with a growing sense of dread. He understood the strategic reality of his position better than anyone in Rome. He pulled out the maps of East Africa and traced the borders with his finger. To the north and west lay Sudan, British. To the south lay Kenya, British. To the east lay British Somaliland. The only access to the outside world was through the Suez Canal, controlled by the British, or through the Strait of Gibraltar, controlled by the British. Italian East Africa was a prison. It was a massive fortress with no resupply lines. If Italy entered the war, Amedeo knew that not a single gallon of fuel, not a single bullet, not a single tire would reach him from Italy. He would be fighting a siege on a continental scale. He wrote frantic letters to Rome, pleading for equipment. He needed modern artillery. He was sent cannons from 1918. He needed anti-aircraft guns. He was sent nothing. He needed trucks. He was sent vehicles that broke down in the thin mountain air. He warned Mussolini explicitly, if we enter the war, we can hold out for a few months, perhaps a year. After that, we will be suffocated. Mussolini ignored him. The Duce was mesmerized by Hitler's lightning victories in France. He believed the war would be over in a few weeks. He thought he could jump into the conflict at the last minute, grab a seat at the peace conference, and claim his spoils without having to do any real fighting. On June 10, 1940, the nightmare became reality. Amedeo gathered his staff around the radio in the Viceroy's palace to hear Mussolini's voice booming from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in Rome. Italy had declared war on Great Britain and France. Witnesses say Amedeo listened to the speech in stony silence. When it was over, he simply stood up, adjusted his uniform, and said, "Now the tragedy begins." The situation was immediately dire. Amedeo commanded a force that looked impressive on paper, nearly 300,000 men. But this number was a mirage. The vast majority were askari, colonial troops of varying loyalty and training. The Italian units were poorly equipped. Their tanks, the CV-33 tankettes, were essentially armored lawnmowers with machine guns, useless against modern weaponry. Their air force consisted of biplanes that were agile, but hopelessly outgunned by the modern British Hurricanes that would soon arrive. And yet the Etonian in him refused to yield to despair. If he was going to lose, he would lose fighting. He decided that the best defense was a good offense. He couldn't sit and wait for the British to build up their forces. He had to strike while they were still weak. In July 1940, he ordered probing attacks into Sudan and Kenya, capturing minor border towns like Kassala and Moyal. These were morale boosters, little victories to show Rome that the empire was alive. But his eyes were set on a bigger prize: British Somaliland. British Somaliland was the weak link in the British chain. It was lightly defended, garrisoned by a small force of the Somaliland Camel Corps and a few British battalions. If Amedeo could take it, he would drive the British into the sea, secure his eastern flank, and win a major propaganda victory. In August 1940, Amedeo unleashed his invasion. He organized a force of 25,000 men, divided into 3 columns. The terrain was hellish, a scorched desert of thorns and rock where temperatures regularly soared above 40 degrees Celsius. The logistics of moving an army through such land were a nightmare. Water had to be trucked in. Heat stroke was a greater killer than enemy fire. But Amedeo directed the campaign with the skill of a seasoned general. He used his superior numbers to outflank the British positions. The key battle took place at the Tug Argan Gap, a narrow pass through the hills protecting the capital, Berbera. For 4 days, the Italians assaulted the British positions. The fighting was fierce. The Blackshirts and Ascari charged up steep, rocky slopes into the teeth of machine gun fire. Amedeo was constantly on the move, flying in his personal aircraft between the columns, landing on makeshift airstrips to encourage his commanders, his tall frame emerging from the dust clouds like a vision. The British commander, General Godwin Austen, realized he was about to be encircled. On August 15th, he requested permission to evacuate. The Royal Navy arrived at Berbera, and in a humiliation that stung London deeply, the British Army fled. They left behind equipment, supplies, and their prestige. On August 19, 1940, Italian troops entered Berbera. The Union Jack was lowered. The Italian tricolor was raised. Amedeo had done the impossible. He had conquered a British colony. It was the only time in the entire Second World War that Italy would win a campaign on its own, without German help. The news was greeted with hysteria in Rome. Mussolini was ecstatic. He awarded medals, gave speeches, and proclaimed that the Italian soldier was invincible. But in Addis Ababa, there was no champagne. Amedeo walked through the captured port of Berbera, looking at the empty warehouses and the sea beyond. He knew what this victory was. It was a hollow triumph. He had expended precious fuel and ammunition that could not be replaced. He had stretched his lines even thinner. He had poked the British lion, and he knew the lion would not forgive this insult. As 1940 turned into 1941, the silence in East Africa grew heavy. It was the calm before the hurricane. While Amedeo rationed his petrol and tried to keep his aging trucks running with wire and prayers, the British Empire was mobilizing. They came from the vast resources of the Commonwealth. In the north, in Sudan, General William Platt was assembling the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions, hardened professional soldiers who had spent their lives guarding the frontiers of the Raj. In the south, in Kenya, General Alan Cunningham was gathering a force that was a true melting pot of empire. South Africans, Gold Coast regiments from West Africa, Rhodesians, and East African Kings African rifles. They brought with them hundreds of modern trucks, new artillery, and most crucially, the South African Air Force. Amedeo's spies told him what was coming. He saw the reports of the massive buildup. He knew that the British plan was a pincer movement, a giant crushing jaw that would close around the Ethiopian highlands. He had no illusions. He wrote a final letter to his wife Anne, who was back in Italy. In it, he did not speak of victory. He spoke of duty, of honor, and of a strange, calm acceptance of the fate that awaited him. He was a captain on a sinking ship, resolved to stay at the helm until the water closed over his head. In January 1941, the British offensive began. It did not start with a whimper, but with a roar. In the north, Platt's Indian Division smashed into the Italian defenses at Kassala. The Italian retreat was chaotic. The disparity in morale was evident. The Italian conscripts, terrifyingly far from home and fighting for a cause they barely understood, began to surrender in droves. But the elite units, the Alpini, the Bersaglieri, and the loyal Eritrean Ascari, fought with desperate courage. The geography of the war shifted from the deserts to the mountains. The Battle of Keren, fought in February and March 1941 in Eritrea, was one of the most brutal battles of the entire war. It was a vertical battle, fought on razor-sharp peaks and sheer cliffs. Amedeo threw everything he had into holding Keren. He knew it was the gateway to Asmara and the Red Sea. For weeks, the Italians held out against overwhelming odds. The British and Indian troops had to claw their way up the mountains under hand grenade barrages. Amedeo visited the front at Keren. He saw the carnage. He saw his best battalions being ground down to nothing. When Keren finally fell in late March, the road to the heart of the empire was open. Simultaneously, from the south, Cunningham's lightning force was moving at a speed that defied belief. They crossed the deserts of Somalia, entering Mogadishu, then turning north into the Ethiopian Ogaden. They were covering hundreds of miles a week, sweeping aside Italian resistance. The Italian army was melting away. The local Ethiopian population, sensing the change in the wind, rose up. The Arbegnok partisans came down from the hills, cutting supply lines, ambushing convoys, taking their revenge for years of occupation. Amedeo was now trapped in Addis Ababa. The pincer was closing. He had a decision to make. He could stay in the capital and fight a street-to-street battle. It would be a bloodbath. Thousands of civilians would die. The city he had tried to modernize, the city he had grown to have a strange affection for, would be reduced to rubble, or he could leave. He looked at his staff, men who were exhausted, their uniforms stained with sweat and dust. He looked at the reports of the approaching British columns. And he made the choice of a gentleman, not a fanatic. He declared Addis Ababa an open city. He would not turn the capital into a battlefield. He would surrender the city to the British to protect the civilians. But he would not surrender himself. Not yet. He gathered the remnants of his army, about 7,000 men who were still willing to fight. He loaded what little ammunition and food remained onto the last functioning trucks. On a cool morning in April 1941, the Viceroy's convoy pulled out of Addis Ababa. He did not look back. He headed north towards the mountains, towards the one place where he could make a stand that would be worthy of his name. He was heading for Amba Alagi. The mountain loomed in the distance, a dark, foreboding fortress of rock. It was to be his Alamo, his Thermopylae. As the convoy wound its way up the treacherous passes, Amedeo must have known he was driving into his own tomb. But there was no fear in him, only a grim determination. He had lost the empire. He had lost the war. All that was left to save was the honor of the House of Savoy. And for Amedeo, that was worth dying for. The ascent to Amba Alagi was a journey from the frying pan into the freezer. As the convoy wound its way higher into the Ethiopian highlands, the sweltering heat of the plains gave way to a biting thin wind that cut through the tropical uniforms of the Italian conscripts. The landscape transformed into something prehistoric. Jagged basalt cliffs, deep gorges shrouded in mist, and a silence so profound it felt heavy. Amba Alagi itself was a geological monster, a natural citadel rising over 10,000 feet above sea level, dominating the crucial road that connected the north of the country to the south. It was honeycombed with caves and natural galleries, which the Italians had frantically expanded with dynamite and pickaxes in the preceding weeks. It was here, in this eagle's nest of rock, that Amedeo would make his final statement to the world. When they arrived, the reality of their situation became terrifyingly clear. They were not just retreating, they were entombing themselves. The fortress was formidable, yes, virtually impregnable to direct assault, but it was also a trap. There was no back door, there was no path for further retreat. They had food for 3 months, ammunition for perhaps less. But water was the ghost at the feast. The springs on the mountain were few and trickled slowly. For an army of 7,000 men plus pack animals and wounded, every drop was measured in gold. The Duke established his headquarters not in a comfortable villa, but in a damp, dimly lit dugout, cut into the rock face. He slept on a camp bed, wrapped in gray wool blankets to ward off the freezing night temperatures. His staff urged him to take the safest, deepest cave, but he refused. He positioned himself where he could see the lines, where he could be seen by his men. He knew that, in a siege, morale is more brittle than bone. If the men saw their viceroy hiding, the defense would collapse in an hour. So the tall figure of the Duke became a fixture of the perimeter, walking the trench lines, his breath pluming in the cold air, checking machine gun nests and speaking to the terrified young soldiers who were gripping their rifles with white knuckles. By late April 1941, the British trap snapped shut. The pincer movement that Amedeo had foreseen months ago was now a reality visible from his observation post. To the north, the forces of General William Platt, fresh from their victory at Keren, were setting up artillery batteries. To the south, the South African and Rhodesian troops of General Alan Cunningham were closing in. Amba Alagi was completely surrounded. The Italians were a tiny island of gray-green uniforms in a sea of khaki. The bombardment began in early May, and it was relentless. The British had hauled heavy howitzers up the mountain passes, feats of engineering that rivaled the Italians' own road building. The shelling was not just a physical assault, it was psychological torture. On the rocky slopes of Amba Alagi, an artillery shell didn't just explode, it shattered the mountain itself. Every impact sent deadly showers of razor-sharp stone splinters, flying in all directions, causing wounds that were often more gruesome than those from shrapnel. The noise was amplified by the canyons, a constant rolling thunder that made sleep impossible. Inside the caves, life descended into a troglodyte existence. The air grew foul with the smell of unwashed bodies, cordite, and fear. The latrines were overflowing, but the true horror was the thirst. The British, realizing the water vulnerability, targeted the springs and the water trucks. The daily ration was cut, then cut again. Men began to lick the condensation off the cold cave walls. Despair began to set in, but so did a strange, fatalistic camaraderie. It was in this hell that the legend of Amedeo was cemented. He seemed to be everywhere at once. When a direct hit buried a squad of Alpini troops in a collapsed dugout, the Duke was among the first on the scene, digging with his bare hands alongside the rescuers, his immaculate uniform covered in dust and blood. When the field hospital, a nightmare of screaming men in bloody bandages in a dark cavern, ran low on anesthetics, he spent hours there, simply sitting with the dying, holding their hands, offering the only comfort he had left, his presence. He was no longer the viceroy of the empire. He was the father of a doomed family. The British commanders, watching through their binoculars from the surrounding ridges, were baffled by the tenacity of the defense. They had expected the Italians to crumble after a few days of heavy shelling. They knew the Italians were cut off, starving, and outnumbered. Yet every time the British infantry tried to storm the lower slopes, they were met with withering machine gun fire and grenades. The Italians were fighting with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. But the British had a weapon more potent than artillery. They had the South African Air Force. On May 10th, a lucky or skillfully placed bomb changed everything. It struck the main fuel depot near the Italian water tanks. The explosion was catastrophic. It didn't just destroy the fuel. It ruptured the oil drums, sending thousands of gallons of black sludge pouring into the primary water reservoir. The water supply was poisoned. The liquid that came out of the taps was a foul black mixture of oil and water. It was undrinkable, toxic. The men tried to filter it through rags, through sand, but the taste of oil remained. Dysentery exploded through the ranks. The hospital was overwhelmed. Men were dying not from bullets, but from dehydration and disease. Amedeo walked to the reservoir and looked at the black scum floating on the water. He dipped his finger in, smelled it, and wiped it on his breeches. He knew this was the end. To continue fighting now would not be soldiering. It would be murder. He had held out for nearly a month. He had tied down substantial British forces, preventing them from being redeployed to North Africa to fight Rommel. He had done his duty. On the night of May 14th, he gathered his senior officers. The candlelight flickered on their gaunt, bearded faces. They were exhausted, their eyes hollow. Amedeo laid it out simply. They had no water, no hope of relief, and the wounded were suffering in agony. He asked for their opinions, but they all knew the decision had already been made. They would surrender. But Amedeo was not going to walk out with a white flag waving in shame. He was a Savoy. He dictated the terms of the surrender proposal to the British. He demanded the honors of war. This was a bold, almost arrogant demand for a defeated army. The honors of war is an ancient military tradition dating back to the age of chivalry. It allows the defeated garrison to march out in military formation, with their flags flying, their officers wearing their swords, and their men carrying their rifles. They are saluted by the victorious army before being disarmed. It is the ultimate sign of respect from one warrior to another, an acknowledgement that the defeat was due to circumstance, not a lack of courage. General Platt received the request. A lesser man might have laughed. The Italians were broken. He could simply wait a few more days for thirst to kill them all. But Platt was a soldier of the old school. He had seen how the Italians had fought at Keren and Amba Alaghi. He knew the cost his own men had paid, and he knew who was commanding them. He accepted the terms. May 19th, 1941, the day of the surrender. The guns fell silent for the first time in weeks. The silence was deafening, amplifying the sound of the wind whistling through the crags. On the winding road leading down from the fortress, the stage was set for one of the most poignant scenes of World War II. The British and Commonwealth troops lined the road. Scots Guards, Indian Sikhs with their turbans, South African infantry. They stood at present arms, their bayonets forming a steel corridor. A pipe band from the Transvaal Scottish Regiment began to play. The haunting sound of bagpipes drifted up the mountain, and then they came. Down the dusty track marched the survivors of Amba Alaghi. They were a ragged sight, uniforms torn, boots falling apart, faces gaunt with hunger and covered in the grime of the caves. But they marched in step. They held their heads high. At the front of the column walked the Duke of Aosta. He had shaved and put on his best uniform, though it hung loosely on his emaciated frame. He wore his leather-flying gloves, a monocle screwed into his eye, and his peaked cap pulled low. He walked with a stride that hid the malaria burning in his blood. As he passed the lines of British soldiers, eyes locked. There was no jeering, no cheering, just a solemn, heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic tramp of boots and the skirl of the pipes. At the bottom of the hill, General Platt and his staff were waiting. Amedeo halted his column. He stepped forward, isolated in the space between the two armies. He saluted the British general. Platt returned the salute, holding it for a long moment. It was an image that captured the strange duality of the moment, the victory of the British Empire and the personal triumph of an Italian prince who had managed to salvage dignity from the wreckage of defeat. "The war is over for us," Amedeo said quietly. "You fought with great gallantry," Platt replied. The weapons were stacked, the flags were furled. The 7,000 men of the Amba Alaghi garrison were loaded onto trucks to begin their journey into captivity. Amedeo was separated from his men. As a royal duke and a commander-in-chief, he was a high-value prisoner. He was driven away in a staff car watching the mountain recede in the rearview mirror. He left behind the graves of his soldiers, the caves that had been his home, and the dream of an Italian Africa. He was 42 years old and he had less than a year to live. The journey to captivity was a slow descent into a different kind of darkness. He was flown first to Khartoum in Sudan, then down to Kenya. The British decided to house him at Donyo Sabuk, a sprawling estate about 40 miles from Nairobi. It was not a prison cell in the traditional sense. It was a comfortable house with a garden, surrounded by rolling hills that vaguely resembled the landscape of Tuscany. But it was a cage nonetheless, surrounded by barbed wire and guards. For a man of action, the idleness was corrosive. Amedeo tried to keep a routine. He rose early, exercised as much as his failing health would allow, and spent hours reading. He read everything he could get his hands on: history, philosophy, English novels. He wrote letters, hundreds of them. He wrote to his wife, Anne, and his two young daughters, Margherita and Maria Cristina, who were far away in Italy. The letters were heavily censored, and he knew they might not arrive for months, if at all. He poured his heart out onto the paper, expressing a profound loneliness and a growing sense of fatalism. "I am a ghost," he wrote in a diary entry from this period. "I walk, I talk, I eat, but my life is behind me. It is buried on the mountain." The malaria he had contracted years before in the bush began to return with a vengeance. The stress of the siege and the sudden change in altitude and climate weakened his immune system. He began to suffer from high fevers, shaking chills that left him bedridden for days. The British doctors were attentive. They respected their royal prisoner and did not want him to die on their watch, but medical supplies were limited, and the treatments for malaria in 1941 were harsh and debilitating. But it wasn't just malaria. A more insidious killer was waking up in his lungs: tuberculosis. The damp, cold conditions in the caves of Amba Alagi had done their damage. He developed a persistent, hacking cough. He lost his appetite. The towering giant began to shrink. His clothes, already loose at the surrender, began to hang off him like rags on a scarecrow. Despite his condition, Amedeo remained the unofficial leader of the Italian POWs in Kenya. There were tens of thousands of them, scattered in camps across the region. He couldn't visit them, but he used his influence with the British authorities to improve their conditions. He bombarded the camp commandants with letters demanding better food, more medicine, and access to mail for his men. Even in his own decline, his primary concern was for the soldiers he had led. In late 1941, he was moved to Camp 354, a dedicated POW facility closer to Nairobi, to be nearer to better medical facilities. The move was an admission that he was dying. He was placed in a small bungalow within the camp hospital compound. The British officers who guarded him noted that he never complained. He maintained the stiff upper lip he had learned at Eton until the very end. He would apologize to the nurses for being a burden. He would ask the guards about the news from the front. Following the war in North Africa and Russia with a detached analytical interest. Christmas 1941 passed in a haze of fever. He was now bedridden most of the time. He had a radio in his room, and he listened to the broadcasts from Rome and London. He heard the propaganda, the lies, the boasts. It all seemed so distant, so meaningless compared to the reality of the sun shifting across the floorboards of his room. One day in early 1942, a British officer, a man who had known Amedeo before the war, came to visit him. He found the Duke sitting in a chair in the garden, wrapped in blankets. They talked about the old days, about hunting in the Alps, about parties in London. For a brief hour, the war vanished. As the officer rose to leave, Amedeo grabbed his wrist with a hand that was almost skeletal. "Tell them," Amedeo whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "Tell them I did my best. Tell them I didn't hate the English. I just loved Italy." The end came in the first week of March 1942. His breathing became shallow and labored. The tuberculosis had consumed his lungs. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In his delirium, he spoke in a mixture of Italian, French, and English. He called out for his mother, for his wife, and strangely, he shouted orders to his pilot, as if he were back in the cockpit of his biplane over the Dolomites, flying high and free above the blood-soaked earth. On March 3, 1942, the breathing stopped. The prince was dead. The telegram that carried the news of the Duke's death traveled through the tangled, wire-crossed nervous system of a world at war. It moved from the British headquarters in Nairobi to Cairo, then across the Mediterranean to the neutral offices of the Red Cross in Geneva. And finally, it slipped into the darkened, fearful capital of Rome. When the news broke, it did not land like a stone in a pond, creating ripples. It landed like a hammer on a pane of glass. The fracture lines were immediate and visible. For the fascist hierarchy, the death of Amedeo of Savoy was a complex, uncomfortable event. Benito Mussolini, sitting in the vast, echoing emptiness of the Palazzo Venezia, reportedly received the news with a cold, almost reptilian detachment. He had always viewed the tall, handsome Duke not as a subordinate, but as a rival, a man whose natural nobility highlighted the Duce's own theatrical thug nature. With Amedeo dead, the threat of a royalist coup led by a charismatic soldier was gone. But Mussolini was also a master propagandist. He knew that he could not ignore the death of a national hero. And so, the machine went to work. The newspapers, controlled by the party, printed black-bordered editions, eulogizing the hero of Amba Alaghi. They tried to twist his memory, to paint him as a martyr for fascism, a devoted follower of the regime who had died cursing the British. But the Italian people knew better. In the cafes of Turin, in the market squares of Naples, and in the bombed-out streets of Milan, the grief was genuine and private. They didn't mourn a fascist. They mourned the Duca di Ferro, the Iron Duke, who had refused to fly home to safety when the war turned against him. They mourned the man who had stayed with his troops. In a country that was increasingly starving, where sons were freezing to death in the Russian snow or drowning in the Mediterranean, Amedeo became a symbol of a lost Italy, an Italy of honor, not bluster. In London, the reaction was one of genuine respect. Winston Churchill, who had spent the last 2 years demonizing the Italian leadership, reportedly paused when he heard the news and muttered, "A gallant foe." The funeral preparations began immediately. And this is where the story circles back to that surreal image in the Kenyan dust. The British could have buried him quickly in a pauper's grave and forgotten him. But General Platt, the man who had accepted his surrender, intervened. He ordered a funeral with full military honors. It was a logistical challenge. They had to find a coffin large enough for his frame. They had to organize a guard of honor. On the day of the burial, the Italian prisoners in the camp were allowed to line the route. They wept openly as the hearse passed, kneeling in the dust, making the sign of the cross. They weren't weeping for a viceroy. They were weeping for the man who had dug them out of the rubble at Amba Alaghi. The coffin was draped in the Italian flag, the royal flag with the Savoy shield, not the fascist banner. It was carried by British soldiers. At the graveside, the British chaplain read the service. The last post was sounded by a bugler, the notes hanging in the hot, still air. As the coffin was lowered, the British officers saluted. It was the final act of the Gentlemen's War, a relic of a code of conduct that was rapidly vanishing from the world, crushed under the treads of T-34s and the boots of the SS. Amedeo left behind a complex legacy. He was the good duke in a bad war. He was a man who tried to bring civilization to a conquest that was inherently uncivilized. He built roads that are still used, hospitals that still stand, and a reputation that somehow remained spotless in a sea of mud. He proved that it is possible to serve a corrupt regime without becoming corrupt oneself, but he also proved that such a path leads only to tragedy. He was the viceroy who never went home. He lies there still, in the foreign soil he was sent to rule, a permanent prisoner of history. His tomb in the Italian War Memorial Church in Nairi is a pilgrimage site, not for fascists, but for those who understand the terrible complexity of duty. It is a quiet place, far from the noise of the modern world. If you stand there, in the silence, you can almost hear the echo of the bagpipes on the mountain, and the ghostly voice of an Etonian prince whispering the epitaph of a generation. I did my best. While Rome mourned, the war in East Africa did not end simply because the viceroy had died. This is a chapter of the story that often vanishes from the history books, overshadowed by the drama of Amedeo's surrender, but it is essential to understanding the full scope of the sacrifice he initiated. When Amedeo surrendered at Amba Alagi in May 1941, he had ordered the remaining Italian forces to continue the fight. He knew that every day the British were forced to keep troops in Ethiopia was a day those troops were not fighting the Germans and Italians in Libya and Egypt. The torch of resistance passed to General Guglielmo Nassi, a man of immense stubbornness who was holed up in the city of Gondar, in the chaotic mountainous terrain north of Lake Tana. Gondar became the final footnote of the Italian Empire. For 6 long months after Amedeo was taken prisoner, Nassi and his ragged army of 40,000 men, a mix of Italians and loyal colonial troops, held out. They were completely cut off from the world. No planes landed, no trucks arrived. They were fighting with ammunition stocks from 1935 and eating mule meat. The British, frustrated that the Italian sideshow was dragging on, were forced to divert significant air power and infantry to crush this final pocket. They bombed Gondar relentlessly. The rainy season turned the battlefield into a slurry of mud and blood. Yet the ghost of Amedeo seemed to hang over the defense. The Italian officers at Gondar spoke of him often. They fought on because to surrender too early would be to insult the memory of the Duke who had held Amba Alagi. It wasn't until November 27, 1941, nearly 6 months after the fall of Addis Ababa, that Gondar finally surrendered. Only then was the map of East Africa truly colored British red. Amedeo's strategy had worked. He and his successors had tied down hundreds of thousands of Allied troops for nearly a year and a half, a strategic delay that undoubtedly saved the Axis forces in North Africa from immediate collapse. But the end of the fighting was only the beginning of the ordeal for the survivors. The 7,000 men who had marched down the mountain with Amedeo, along with the tens of thousands captured elsewhere, were now scattered across the British Empire. They became the invisible population of the war. They were shipped to sprawling camps in Kenya, South Africa, India, and even as far away as Australia and the United States. In the camps of Kenya, particularly in the shadow of Mount Kenya, the memory of the Duke became a kind of secular religion. These men were living in a vacuum. They had no idea when or if they would ever go home. Depression was rampant. Suicide was not uncommon. To keep their sanity, they clung to the story of their commander. They told and retold the stories of his visits to the front lines, his sharing of rations, his refusal to abandon them. There is a remarkable, almost cinematic story from these Kenyan camps that illustrates the atmosphere Amedeo left behind. It involves 3 Italian prisoners, Felice Benuzzi, Giovanni Balletto, and Vincenzo Barsotti. Rotting in boredom in Camp 354, the same camp where Amedeo had died, they decided to escape. But they didn't want to escape to neutral territory or freedom, which was impossible given the geography. They decided to escape to climb Mount Kenya. They spent months hoarding food, crafting ice axes out of scrap metal, and sewing climbing gear from the blankets. They broke out, climbed the dangerous 17,000-foot peak to plant an Italian flag, and then, in a move of surreal defiance, broke back into the prison camp. They did it simply to prove that their spirits were not broken, that they were still men. When the British commandant found out, he didn't execute them. He gave them a lighter sentence, recognizing the sheer audacity of the feat. It was exactly the kind of sporting spirit Amedeo had embodied. The Duke was dead, but his ethos of dignity in the face of hopelessness was alive in the barbed wire enclosures. However, the most tragic legacy of the Duke's death was not found in Africa, but back in Italy within the walls of his own home. Amedeo left behind a widow, Princess Anne of Orleans, the Duchess of Aosta. Anne was a woman of steel, a royal in every sense of the word. Tall, imposing, and deeply religious, she was the sister of the claimant to the French throne. When Amedeo left for Africa in 1937, she had stayed behind in Italy to care for their 2 young daughters, Margherita and Maria Cristina. For Anne, the war was a distant nightmare until the telegram arrived. Suddenly, she was a widow in a country that was rapidly spiraling into disaster. She lived in the Castello di Miramare near Trieste, a white fairy tale castle perched on a cliff overlooking the Adriatic Sea. It was a place of ghosts. It had been the home of Maximilian of Mexico before his tragic execution, and now it was the home of the grieving Duchess. Throughout 1942 and the first half of 1943, Anne lived a life of quiet seclusion. She devoted herself to the Red Cross, working tirelessly to get information about the Italian prisoners of war rotting in British camps. She felt a personal responsibility for them. They were her husband's men. She wrote thousands of letters, used her royal connections to nag the bureaucracy, and tried to send parcels of food and medicine to Kenya. She was trying to be the mother to the soldiers that Amedeo had been the father to, but the ground beneath her feet was shifting. By the summer of 1943, Italy was collapsing. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Rome was bombed. Mussolini was deposed in July, arrested by the king. The fascist regime evaporated overnight, leaving behind a confused, terrified nation. For a brief moment, there was hope. The Italians thought the war was over. Then came September 8th, 1943, the armistice. The Italian government secretly signed a peace treaty with the Allies and announced it to the world. It was intended to save the country, but instead it plunged it into chaos. The German army, which had been pouring divisions into Italy to prop up their failing ally, immediately turned from friends to occupiers. The Wehrmacht launched Operation Axis, the disarming and occupation of Italy. The king and the government fled Rome in disgrace, heading south to the safety of Allied lines. But they left the rest of the royal family behind. Princess Anne and her 2 little daughters were at the Palazzo della Cisterna in Florence when the news broke. They were trapped. The Nazis hated the House of Savoy. They viewed the armistice as the ultimate betrayal, a stab in the back. Hitler wanted revenge. He wanted to punish the Italian royals who he believed had conspired against Mussolini. And who was the most prominent royal figure within their grasp? The widow of the Duke of Aosta. It is a terrible irony that echoes the fate of her husband. Amedeo had died a prisoner of the British, treated with chivalry and respect. Anne was about to become a prisoner of the Nazis, and chivalry was not a word in the SS vocabulary. In late 1943, German officers arrived at her residence. They were polite but icy. They informed the Duchess that she was being placed under protective custody. It was a euphemism for arrest. Anne, drawing herself up to her full height, which matched her late husband's, demanded to know by whose authority. The answer was simple: the Reich. At first she was kept under house arrest in Italy, but as the Allied armies pushed north, the Germans decided to move their royal hostages. In the summer of 1944, Anne and her 2 daughters, along with other members of the Savoy family, were ordered to pack their bags. They were being deported to the Greater German Reich. The journey was a descent into the underworld. They were not put on a luxury train. They were moved under armed guard, treated as political assets to be traded or liquidated depending on the whim of the Führer. They were taken to Austria, into the heart of the crumbling Nazi Empire. Their destination was Hirschegg, a small village in the Kleinwalser Tal valley in the Austrian Alps. They were imprisoned in the Yefen Hotel, a ski resort that had been converted into a high-security detention center for prominent prisoners. Life at Hirschegg was a bizarre, terrifying purgatory. The Duchess and her children were surrounded by SS guards. They were cut off from the world. They had no idea if they would survive the war. The food was scarce: watery soup, black bread, the occasional potato. For the 2 young princesses, Margarita and Maria Cristina, this was their childhood. They had lost their father to the African War, and now they were losing their freedom to the European War. Anne proved to be indomitable. Just as Amedeo had held the morale of his men at Amba Alagi, Anne held the morale of her family in the Austrian prison. She refused to be intimidated by the SS commandant. She insisted on maintaining a school routine for her daughters. She taught them history, French, and mathematics, using whatever scraps of paper they could find. She kept her husband's memory alive for them, telling them stories of Africa, of his flying days, of his honor. She told them that they were Savoys, and Savoys did not beg. The conditions in the camp worsened as the winter of 1944 set in. The Third Reich was collapsing, and the chaos reached even the remote Alps. Supplies stopped arriving. The guards grew more nervous and more dangerous. There was a very real fear that as the end approached, the SS would execute their prisoners to eliminate witnesses. Anne slept with one eye open, guarding her daughters. Meanwhile, back in Italy, the legacy of the name Aosta was taking a strange turn. The country was in a civil war. In the north, Mussolini had been rescued by German commandos and set up a puppet state, the Italian Social Republic. In the south, the king ruled a co-belligerent government fighting alongside the Allies. But in the mountains of Italy, the partisans were rising. And strangely, many monarchist partisans, soldiers who had refused to serve the German puppet state, formed brigades named after the Duke. The Amedeo d'Aosta battalion fought against the Nazis in the valleys of Piedmont. It was a testament to his complex appeal. Anti-fascist partisans fighting in the name of a fascist-appointed viceroy, because to them, he represented the army and the nation, not the party. Back in Africa, the silence over Amedeo's grave in Nyeri was disturbed only by the wind. The British had won the continent, but the empire Amedeo had built was dismantling itself. The roads he had paved were now being used by American trucks carrying supplies to Russia via the Persian corridor. The hospitals he built were treating British wounded. The Africa Orientale Italiana was dead, wiped from the map as a political entity. but the human connection remained. In Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie had returned to his throne in Addis Ababa in May 1941, exactly when Amedeo was surrendering at Amba Alagi. The emperor was a man of great dignity, not unlike the duke. When he heard of Amedeo's death, he did not gloat. He is said to have expressed regret. He recognized that Amedeo had been a man caught in a trap, a decent administrator who had tried to mitigate the horrors of the occupation. There were no desecrations of Italian war graves in Ethiopia under Selassie's orders. The dead were left to rest in peace. As the spring of 1945 arrived, the war in Europe reached its crescendo. In the Austrian Alps, the sound of artillery began to echo through the valleys. The French army and American units were closing in on the redoubt where the Duchess and her children were held. May 1945. 4 years almost to the day since Amedeo had walked down the mountain at Amba Alagi to surrender to the British. The guards at Hersheg began to disappear. They shed their uniforms and melted into the forests. The prisoners woke up one morning to find the gates unguarded. The liberation, when it came, was chaotic and joyful. French troops arrived first. When they realized that the sister of the French pretender was among the prisoners, there was a celebration. Anne, thin and exhausted but unbroken, walked out of the hotel holding the hands of her daughters. She had survived. The family had survived. But they were returning to a world that had changed fundamentally. Italy was in ruins. The monarchy was teetering on the edge of extinction. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, was despised for his support of Mussolini. His son Umberto II would reign for only a month before a referendum in 1946 would abolish the monarchy forever and create the Italian Republic. Anne and her daughters returned to an Italy that no longer had a place for them. They were citizens now, not royals. The palaces were seized or closed, the titles were hollow. But Anne carried something more valuable than a crown. She carried the reputation of her husband. In the post-war years, as Italy tried to bury the memory of fascism, as it tried to forget the shame of the racial laws and the disastrous alliance with Hitler, the figure of Amedeo d'Aosta remained untouched by the collective amnesia. He was the one piece of the fascist era that Italians could look at without shame. He was the clean soldier. The veterans began to return. In 1946 and 1947, the white ships brought the POWs back from Kenya and India. Emaciated, aged beyond their years, carrying their cardboard suitcases, they stepped off the ships in Naples and Genoa. They looked for a country that no longer existed. They were strangers in their own land. The new republic didn't want to hear about their suffering. It wanted to move on. But among themselves, they kept the flame alive. They formed associations. They met in dusty halls to drink wine and talk about Karen, about Amba Alagi, about the heat and the flies. And always the conversation would turn to the Duke. They spoke of him not as a distant royal, but as a companion who had gone ahead. They remembered the specific way he tilted his head when he listened, the way he would share a cigarette, the way he stood tall when the shelling was at its worst. Amedeo had become a myth, and like all myths, he was growing larger in death than he had been in life. But myths do not have bodies, and Amedeo's body was still in Africa, thousands of miles away, lying in the red earth of Kenya, watched over by the same lions and elephants that roamed the land he had briefly, tragically tried to tame. The question of whether he should come home would become the final, lingering controversy of his story. The years that followed the birth of the Italian Republic in 1946 were years of amnesia. Italy was a country trying desperately to wash the black shirt of fascism from its skin. It was a painful, often hypocritical scrubbing. The new political class, many of whom had been silent during the regime, now wanted to erase the colonial past entirely. The African empire became a taboo subject. The loss of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia was not mourned. It was buried under a heavy blanket of silence. The logic was simple. If we don't talk about the empire, we don't have to talk about the gas attacks, the racial laws, or the massacres. But silence is not the same as forgetting. And for two groups of people, forgetting was impossible. The first group was the veterans, the hundreds of thousands of men who had returned from the British POW camps. They found themselves marginalized in the New Italy. They were the embarrassing reminders of a failed adventure. They had no parades, no recognition. They carried the malaria in their blood and the memories of the heat in their minds. For them, Amedeo was not a historical figure. He was the anchor of their dignity. In the smoky backrooms of veterans' associations in Rome, Milan, and Naples, the picture of the Duke was always on the wall. It wasn't the official portrait of the Viceroy in his white uniform. It was usually a grainy photograph from the prison camp. Amedeo in shorts and a tattered shirt, thin and bearded, smiling weakly. This was the saint of their secular religion. They told stories that grew in the telling, transforming Amedeo into a figure of almost Arthurian purity. They remembered how he had refused the British offer of a special villa, insisting on staying in the camp until his health collapsed. They remembered how he had sold his personal watch to buy quinine for a sick private. In a republic that felt void of heroes, the dead prince became the private hero of the defeated. The second group who could not forget was the family. Duchess Anne of Aosta, having survived the Nazi prison in Austria, settled into a quiet, dignified exile within her own country. She refused to leave Italy, even though the monarchy had been abolished. She raised her daughters, Margherita and Maria Cristina, with the discipline of soldiers and the grace of princesses. But there was a gaping hole in their lives. The husband and father was not in the crypt of the Superga Basilica in Turin, where centuries of Savoy ancestors lay under marble effigies. He was in Yeri. The question of the body became a silent struggle between the family, the veterans, and the state. In the 1950s and 60s, the Italian government began a program to repatriate the remains of the war dead. Ships brought back thousands of zinc coffins from Russia, from the Balkans, from North Africa. Families wanted their sons home. It would have been natural, expected even, for the Duke of Aosta to be brought back with full state honors. He was, after all, the highest-ranking Italian casualty of the war. But he didn't come back. The decision was rooted in a sentiment that Amedeo himself had expressed during his captivity. He had told his fellow officers that if he died, he wanted to lie where his men lay. He felt that a commander who could not lead his troops home in life had a moral obligation to remain with them in death. To remove him from the cemetery in Neri, where he was surrounded by over 600 Italian soldiers, would be a betrayal. It would be an act of royal privilege that went against everything he had stood for on the mountain of Amba Alagi. So a tacit agreement was reached. The Duke would stay in Africa. This decision transformed the Italian War Memorial Church in Yeri into something unique. It is not just a cemetery, it is a sanctuary of a specific kind of memory. The church itself was built by the Italian prisoners during their captivity. It is a beautiful, simple structure, housing the marble sarcophagus of the Duke in front of the altar. But what makes it powerful is the rows of simple crosses that flank it. Here lies a general, there lies a private. Here lies a prince, there lies a peasant from Sicily. In death, the hierarchy of the army and the rigid class structure of the 1940s were dissolved. They were simply Italians who had died far from home. As the decades rolled on, the geopolitical map of the world changed. The colonial empires crumbled. The Union Jack was lowered in Kenya in 1963. The British left, just as the Italians had. But strangely, the memory of Amedeo survived the anti-colonial purge. In post-independence Kenya, the Italian church was respected. It wasn't vandalized. The local Kikuyu population, many of whom remembered the war, had no hatred for the tall man who was buried there. He was part of the landscape now, a ghost of a time when the world had gone mad. Even more remarkably, the relationship between the memory of Amedeo and the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, remained one of distant, respectful tragedy. Selassie, the man whose country had been stolen by Amedeo's government, was a complex figure. He was a victim of fascism, yet he was also an aristocrat who understood the burden of rule. There are accounts suggesting that Selassie distinguished sharply between the brutality of Graziani and the chivalry of Amedeo. When the emperor visited Italy in 1970, receiving a somewhat awkward reception from the Italian government, he did not speak of vengeance. The era of the Italian East Africa was gone, but the personal honor of the Viceroy seemed to be the one bridge that remained standing over the river of blood. In Italy, the 1970s and 80s brought a wave of historical revisionism. Historians began to open the archives. The crimes of Italian colonialism were finally laid bare. Books were published detailing the use of mustard gas, the concentration camps, the apartheid-like systems. The myth of Italiani brava gente, the idea that Italians were essentially benign colonizers compared to the British or French, was shattered. The reputation of Rodolfo Graziani was rightfully destroyed. He is remembered today as a war criminal and a butcher, and yet Amedeo escaped this condemnation. The more historians dug, the more his reputation as an anomaly was confirmed. They found his letters protesting the brutality. They found the orders he signed granting clemency. They found the testimony of British officers who couldn't stop praising him. He became the exception that proved the rule. In a strange way, he became a shield for the Italian conscience. He allowed Italians to say, yes, it was a criminal war, but look at Amedeo. We were capable of honor too. However, this veneration had a cost. By elevating Amedeo to the status of a saint, the tragic reality of his life was often smoothed over. He wasn't a saint. He was a man trapped in a fatal compromise. He had served a regime he privately despised. He had worn the uniform of a dictator he loathed. He had fought a war he knew was suicidal. The tragedy of Amedeo is not just that he died young. It is that his virtues, loyalty, duty, courage were weaponized by a system that had no virtue. He was the perfect soldier for the wrong cause. The survivors of Amba Alaghi began to die of old age. The annual pilgrimages to the shrines in Italy became smaller. The voices that could say, "I was there, I saw him," were silenced one by one. The story of the Viceroy began to drift from memory into history. But in the late 20th century, a curious thing happened. A new generation, unconnected to the war, began to rediscover him. They were drawn not by the politics, but by the sheer human drama of the story. In an age of cynical politicians and carefully managed public images, the story of the prince who died in a prison camp with his men felt incredibly raw and authentic. It resonated with the timeless archetype of the noble loser, the Hector of Troy, the Robert E. Lee, figures whose defeat is more compelling than their enemy's victory. His daughters, Margherita and Maria Cristina, grew up, married, and had children of their own. They became the living links to the legend. They visited Kenya. They stood before the tomb in Nyeri. For them, the historical figure was always simply Papa, the tall man who had lifted them up to the sky before getting on a plane and vanishing forever. Their quiet dignity in the decades after the war mirrored his own. They never sought the limelight, never tried to capitalize on their name. They simply kept the watch. And what of the British? The men who had saluted him at the grave? They too grew old. In their memoirs, written in the quiet studies of English country houses, Amedeo always appeared as a figure of light. General Platt, General Cunningham, the officers of the Scots Guards, they all wrote of him with a warmth that is startling to modern readers. They didn't write about him as an enemy. They wrote about him as a lost member of their own tribe. They recognized that Amedeo was in many ways the last of his kind. He belonged to a world where war was still imagined as a contest of honor between gentlemen, a world that was blown to pieces by the industrial slaughter of World War II. When Amedeo died, that world died with him. History is a tapestry woven from the threads of what happened, but it is often the loose threads, the what-ifs, that haunt us the most. As we stand at the end of the story of Prince Amedeo, looking back over the expanse of a century defined by industrial slaughter and ideological madness, there is a question that lingers like the morning mist over the Rift Valley. It is a question that has been whispered in the corridors of Italian palaces and debated by historians for 80 years. What if he had lived? To understand the magnitude of this question, we must look at the state of Italy in 1946. The country was a wreck, physically and morally. The monarchy, the institution that had united Italy in the 19th century, was terminally ill. King Victor Emmanuel III was discredited, seen as the man who had opened the door to Mussolini and then fled when the house caught fire. His son, Umberto II, the May King, was a decent man, but carried the heavy stain of his father's sins. The referendum on the monarchy was lost by a razor-thin margin. The Republic was born, and the Savoys were exiled, banned from setting foot on Italian soil for half a century. The survival of his memory is also a testament to the peculiar, almost paradoxical relationship between the British and the Italians during the war in Africa. It was a gentleman's war, in a way that the war in Russia or the Pacific never was. It was the last gasp of 19th century chivalry before the atomic age erased such notions forever. Amedeo was the protagonist of this final act. The fact that the British officers, men like Platt and Cunningham, were the primary architects of his legend is telling. They saw in him a reflection of themselves, or perhaps a reflection of what they hoped they would be in similar circumstances. They didn't honor him because he was a prince. They honored him because he played the game by the rules in a world where the rules were burning. Today, the Italian War Memorial Church in Nyeri stands as a solitary lighthouse in the sea of history, a sanctuary where the silence is heavy with memory. The inscription is modest: S.A.R. Amedeo di Savoia, Duca d'Aosta, Viceroy d'Ethiopia. Pilgrims still come. They are fewer now, mostly the children and grandchildren of the men who died there. They come to find a connection to a grandfather they never knew, a man who vanished into the empire and never returned. They find him there, resting under the same earth as his viceroy. There is a powerful emotional closure in seeing the ranks of crosses. It says that in the end, the rank did not matter. The suffering was shared, and so the rest is shared. The story of Prince Amedeo is not a story of victory. It is not a story of a great conquest or a political triumph. It is a story of defeat, but it is a defeat so magnificent, so steeped in personal integrity, that it feels like a victory of the human spirit. In a world that is often obsessed with winning at any cost, where the ends are used to justify the means, the tall, gaunt figure of the Duke of Aosta stands as a silent rebuke. He reminds us that character is not defined by the outcome of the battle, but by the conduct of the warrior.